Yeah.
It's like
They're really the supplier.
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about. Because my
It's,
I think I get all these pretty fortunate. I think I did.
Yeah.
Garden for-
I'm back. I still find some. Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
You got it.
Thank you for being here. My name is Mayan Kribushe. I'm the Communications and Administration Coordinator here at Gutman Library upstairs. Welcome to our book talk, Restorative Resistance in Higher Education, Leading in an Era of Racial Awakening and Reckoning. James Honan will introduce our author, Richard Reddick, in a moment. And just a reminder that to the people at home, we have the Q&A feature available for questions, and people here can also ask questions at the end. And Jim, you can take it from here. Oh, sorry, we also have a raffle. You can enter your name into the bucket and win a copy of the book.
and get rich. When you ask questions, please use the microphone on the table so that people, it'll pick up on them.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Jim Honan, faculty member here. In my role this afternoon, there is no greater privilege and honor than to do what I'm about to do. So last week, my dear friend Rich Reddick asked if I would moderate this conversation. And of course, I said yes with pleasure. So thank you, friend. He and I have known each other for more than 25 years. We've had the great good fortune of working on research together, teaching together, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What we're going to do this afternoon is I'm going to ask him some questions about this book here and then have some conversation with you. I want to welcome our colleagues on Zoom, so I hope you can see and hear okay. And we'll be able to get your questions in, just so you can use the chat function, work together to get those there. So thank you so much. So Rich Reddick, there you are, Distinguished Service Professor in Educational Leadership and Policy at the University of Texas, Austin. Senior Vice Provost for Curriculum Enrollment, Dean of Undergraduate Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. That's your day job. Rich also spends lots of time here. And so in addition to being a master's and doctoral graduate here, for the past several years, he's been the faculty co-chair of the Institute for Educational Management. He and I work together on that, a program for senior higher education leaders. And then he founded with our colleague, Robin Chapman from the Harvard Kennedy School, an online program called Bravely Confronting Racism, which has been offered several times. So I should also say he has relationships with lots of people in this room here. His faculty advisor here at the Ed School is our dean, Richard Terry Long, and he had a tremendous and long mentoring, research, and collaborative relationship with the late Dr. Charles Willie, our common friend.
Yes.
We welcome you back to the Graduate School of Education, friend. Thanks for coming.
I think I'm done. I think after that, I don't say anything else. Thank you, Jim, for doing this. Thank you, Maya, for putting this together. And thank you all for being here. It is, for those of you who are on Zoom, it's cold outside. It's great to be back. And I just have tons of memories of the space. And actually, Julie just walked in. I remember watching a game show that was on when I was TFing for Julie. So that's always fun. But this is exciting, and Jim, you do me a great honor by doing these wonderful. And I think your post-Hugsy career will be as a talk show.
Thank you so much. Anyway, so I had a great good fortune. I was on the road this week, so I spent a lot of time with Rich's book, and then I just have some questions, high-level questions I'd like to ask and then write to you. So thank you, my friend. All right, first things first. So Rich, tell me what led you to write this book.
So in a lot of ways, I will credit Jane Parnoli, who's the editor that really pulled the book out of me. But this book's been written for 30 years. I think since I started doing this work, even as an undergraduate student, that is framed around the concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There have been experiences, there have been research experiences that seem to kind of fit together. And so I would go give a talk at a university or a community place, and then people are like, well, where's your book? I'm like, I'm not in a book field, educational researcher, we do articles. And Jane approached me in 2019 in Portland and said, your book, what is it going to be about? When is it going to come out? What will it be about? And so I like all those questions up to the last part. I'm like, I don't know. What will I write about? I mean, I have so many ideas. And so if you remember 2019, it was, okay, I'll think about this. And all of a sudden, the clock turned 2020, things changed for all of us. And the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd, I think kind of brought things to a head. And that's when I knew what I wanted to write. So the book was already coming together, but that really sort of urged me to go forward. But the important thing for me, I think, Jim, is that after tenure at UT Austin, I started thinking about doing public scholarship, and I really enjoyed doing that kind of work. I'm a first generation collegian, so my parents do not have journal articles in the house, but if I write something in the CNN opinion or, Fortune magazine, they'll read that. So I like doing that, and I like the engagement I got with that. So I was like, well, this book could be a giant op-ed. and that's the idea I kind of pitched to Jane, and she said, let's talk about that. And we shaped it around these things, but honestly, it was most of the things in the book, I think, were things I had been thinking about for some time. So when the book appeared in September of 2023, people said to me, wow, you timed this book perfectly to sort of deal with the policy environment that's going on right now. I'm like, the book really came into play a long time ago. So that's not how it worked, but a huge benefit. And I thought about my kids in particular, especially issues of racial equity, inclusion, the kind of world I want to live in. So I wanted to make sure that was something I put in writing before I forgot it all. So that's the idea.
So you moved from that framing and you open the book with the statement, which is really helpful in a book. We need to clarify what we are talking about, Rich Reddick, right?
Yes.
And you spend some time talking about the sort of theoretical underpinnings of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Say a word about that. So what are the big ideas in the framing?
So I'm a big believer in making the work accessible. So I could quote a number of scholars, but I use Verna Myers, who's a diversity educator, talks about, everybody's heard this before, like the idea that diversity, education, equity, and inclusion are like bringing people to a party, right? So I wanted to use that as the metaphor. So the diversity is bringing different kinds of people to a party. So, right, you got wallflowers, you got people who are superly, engaged, you got people who are tall or short, you name the characteristic, you bring different kinds of people together, right? Inclusion is making sure those people feel like they actually belong and they matter in the space, right? So for me, as a good host of a party, you want people to have a good time, right? So if I brought you to a party and I just kind of say, oh, the gym's over there, let's let them hang out, that's not a good experience for you. It's not good for me as a guest. So that's what we're looking at. And so for equity, that's ensuring that whatever you bring to the party does not prohibit or limit you from having the full access to the party experience. And I use some work from my good colleague at UT Austin, Liliana Garces, talks about how equity, especially racial equity, is so that those aspects of identity do not limit or prohibit you from achieving all you can achieve. And so it might sound simplistic, but you have to speak in that way, because I think we're in an era where people get very caught up in very, I would say, obscure definitions, and they don't understand what the general idea is. And this book is written for everybody. So far from being a book that's supposed to be, for the scholarly set. I mean, there's scholarship in it, citations are in there, but it's also a book that I think, and I've encouraged people, and I actually have the most, I guess, rewarding thing is hearing people who say, I don't work in higher education, but I've read your book, or I'm looking at your book and I'm really enjoying it, or your book sounds interesting to me because I don't really know how this stuff works. And so that's how I kind of aimed it. And I think with Jane's help, it was really helpful to figure out what's the sort of Vygotskian proximal zone of development to hit, right? So you want people to not be bored by it, or like, I know this stuff already, but you don't want people to feel like this is so dense and obscure. So I think there's something for everybody in the book in those frames.
So I want to go to the title.
Yeah.
And I know it's not random when authors choose book titles. So there's two phrases here. The first sort of element of this is restorative resistance in higher education. The second part is leading in an era of racial awakening and reckoning. So first things first, what is restorative resistance?
So, one thing I thought about as I was writing the book, is like, I've been doing this work for 30+ years. And also I was thinking about the number of people during 2020 in particular who told me, I'm no longer working in the space. It's not sustainable to me. I'm burned out, a lot of that. And I think probably before the George Floyd murder and the period of racial reckoning, I would probably have said, no, you've got to stay in the field. We need you. And I started really recognizing, and it just so happened there were two pretty prominent cases of Black women athletes who said, I'm done right now. So Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, both at that time pretty much said, I'm not performing the way I want to perform. I don't feel safe. I'm going to stop doing this. Great, right? That's fantastic. But the reaction from fairly mediocre, I was going to say white men saying you shouldn't do this, I found really problematic. And I said, the resistance is continuing, right? But it has to be in a way that people can sustain it over time. So I saw both Osaka and Biles performing restorative resistance in the sense they were not ready to do the work right now. Still brilliant what they did, but not right now, this moment. And I think I'm trying to sort of chart ways for people to do the work and engage in the work without having the sense that if they don't do this work, the work collapses. And this kind of comes from the experience I had when I worked with our dear friend, Dean Whitlow, the National Campus Diversity Project here. And we would go to campuses across the country and we would interview people working in the multicultural space, as they were called back then. This is the early 2000s. And we would always encounter this, what happens if I get by a bus, right? These programs, these communities were held together by usually one or two administrators, a group of students that would just invest in this all the time. And you could see it wearing them down, but they also have the sense that if they didn't do the work, it wouldn't continue. And so I'm like, we need to move to a point where the work is able to be put to the side if you need to, because you need to take care of yourself. I'm a big believer in the metaphor of putting the mask on first so you can breathe before you help others. But in 2020, I saw so many people who have been committed to the work just say, I can't do this anymore, right? And I found that heartbreaking because in Austin, Texas, where I'm from, and frankly, for people like yourself and Chuck Willie, people I've known for many years, the work is lifelong, right? They don't do this work for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or a year. I mean, I was talking to students at the University of Texas who were 19 years old and said, I've been registering people to vote since I was 16 years old. And I don't see things I want to see happening in the world. I'm burned out. I'm like, I can't be burned out at 19, So we got to find a way to do this work and engage in the work where it's sustainable and people can kind of find ways to step back into it. So that's the idea behind restorative resistance.
Let me build on that, because you just started to talk about that, the second part of the title, leading in an era of racial awakening and reckoning. So you talk a lot in the book, in the chapters, about how leaders might exercise leadership in a sustainable way.
Yes.
So, very practical question, how does one do that, especially leaders of color leading in the DEI space, which you spent a whole chapter on?
Yeah, so I think what happened for me, Jim, is that I started to befriend a group of activists in Austin. Alice Embry is one of those people. And Alice famously was expelled from the University of Texas for her activism in the 1960s and got her degree in the 80s. It's really cool. She came back and got her degree, but was very invested in a number of movements, anti-war movements, all these different great things, stuff that Julie teaches about, right? And I talked to Alice today. She's still doing the work. I'm like, you're still in the game. She's like, yes. But when I would talk to her and other people she knew, they often talked about taking time, right? To raise their family, to work on a project, to do something for themselves. And I think sometimes we sort of assume that the work is relentless. And one really cool thing that happened, I think, probably right after the book was finished, or maybe right during the time. I host a podcast in Austin called Black Austin Matters with my colleague at UT Austin, Lisa Thompson. And we interviewed Chaz Moore, who's a community activist in Austin. And he's involved in everything with social justice in Austin, everything. Chaz is on it. And we talked to Chaz about his life, and he talked about being a fan of Frasier and liking sneakers and all this really fun stuff. And I'm like, that's what the work is done. The work is done by living a life that is a complete life. The work is done by taking care of oneself, first and foremost. The work is done by taking it very seriously, but also finding ways to find joy, right? And one thing I thought was interesting, we both were talking about this picture of Dr. King, and it's a picture of him on vacation in Jamaica in swimming trunks. And we usually see Dr. King in a suit or in his robes, right? We don't just see him like that. But it conveyed the fact that this was a person, despite the fact that he was immersed in this work, took time to take care of his family. And I always think that's the part of Dr. King that I love seeing, is him with his children or with Coretta, where you see him as a full person. And because we have such a close relationship with Chuck Willie, you know, I think about knowing him as a full person versus a scholar activist. So for me, I think it's so vital to think about how do we do the things and not feel guilty for doing those things, right? It's essential. The work is not done if we don't do the things to take care of ourselves. And sometimes that means stepping away from the work until you have a chance to center yourself, to feel more balanced. There's a metaphor in the book I use, which is about the equity gym and working out. And those of you who work out, I had to come to work. There are people in this room who remember when I was not this size. I was a little smaller. And so now I have to work out. And Jim and I, we talk about this a lot, working out, but we work out of the sense of this is something that's sustainable we will do. We also know if we work out too hard, there's a possibility of a sprain or injury, and that puts you in the silence for a little bit longer. So doing the work in a sustainable way that is a way you can do it time after time, building on that work, you know, getting stronger, challenging oneself, but not breaking oneself. And I think it's the big piece that is so critical, is to make sure that we find ways to engage in this work without sort of falling to the wayside. Because there's a lot of people out there who are, you know, bitter, who are crushed because they worked so hard on projects, they didn't come to fruition. They felt like, I can't give any. I'm trying to find a way that we can talk about doing the work where people do not feel that that's the only way to sort of exit burning out.
So it means a lot for me to ask you this next question in this building. And so there's a chapter where you talk about your own journey, and it's about mentoring.
Yes.
And you use the term mentorability. So I'm going to ask you about those. But the question I have for you, because it was very powerful as I read it, I may have been upstairs, is say a word about your mentoring relationship with the late Dr. Charles Willie. And the story was when you first walked into this building, I believe, I forget the year, I'm sure I was upstairs as well, but for me, and to ask this question here, the meaning of place is very powerful.
Sure.
In that concept, having observed this mentoring relationship and watch you co-author books with Dr. Willie and engage in other work, but say a word about mentoring and mentorability, and just give us that sense of that story of your own journey, because that's why you're sitting here.
It's a great story, and I would love to share it with you. I applied, and I'm going to go back a little bit to 1996 or so, when I first had heard of the concept of the Harvard Grad School of Education. I'm first generation, so I knew what Harvard was. I had a previous engagement in Boston where I was in Wheel of Fortune as an undergraduate student. And I remember driving past the garden, the old one, and going to the wing where we were taking the show. And I said to somebody, it's like, so where's Harvard exactly? And the person said to me, well, Harvard's in Cambridge. Sorry. So then I got my geography right, and we drove past Story Drive, like, oh, there it is over there. But I always had this interest in visiting this place, at least. But I thought it was unachievable because it's Harvard. Nobody goes there, but I never heard of. But I decided to order a review book. There's a story about how I encountered a Harvard USP student, Urban Superintendency Program student in Houston when I was teaching. And she kind of made it possible, or maybe think it's something I could do. But I ordered a view book. This day you had to order and get a postcard and they send you a view book. I still have it. And I said to myself, well, Harvard's probably full of, tweed wearing white dudes, so I don't think it's a place for me. And I said to myself, if I open the view book and I see some non-white dudes with tweed jackets, maybe I'll think about Harvard. So I was like, if I see some women, if I see some people of color, so I opened the thing, Roland Hess, director of admissions, black dude. Charles William Elliott, professor of education. That sounds important. Black dude, okay. Segregation, that's something I'm interested in doing. So, okay, my little bit to myself had been satisfied. There are in fact people of color, there are women. This is a place I could actually go. So I apply and I get my information and kind of comes up in March and it shows up. So I'm going to Harvard. So we come up here to Cambridge, 1306 Mass Ave, nice little place, I'll tell you that. And I decided, made a friend, named Brooke Tippins. Brooke said to me, hey, we should go visit the campus and, show up there because we're going to Harvard. We better be like on top of things. This is like August. So we're just like very on top of things. Maybe actually July. We got here very early. And so I wandered into Gutman Library, went to the 4th floor where the Administration Policy and Social Program was. And we walked there and there's a gentleman standing in front of the mailboxes. And he kind of turns a little bit and it's Charles Willie. It's him. And Brooke is like, that's Charles that we were talking about. Go talk to him. I'm like, no. I don't sure if I showered that day. I don't know. No. And so she kind of shoves me. And I'm in front of him, and I'm like, I better say something. I'm like, Dr. Willie, I'm Richard Reddick. I'm from Austin, Texas. He's like, you're from Texas? And we bonded from that second. So Chuck is from Oak Cliff, South Dallas. He's also been in my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. And from that moment on, we were inseparable. I took fully half of my courses, my master's year with Dr. Willie. Partly because of what he was doing, his research interest, because it was him. And I did not wager that I would have a connection like that. I knew I'd come to Harvard and meet nice, important, smart people, but getting to know somebody in a year's time, and the important thing is when I finished that year, and it's like drinking from a fire hose, I tell people that all the time. We stayed in touch, and I mean old school in touch. So Chuck would write postcards. And you remember Chuck's really flowing handwriting, and he'd send me a note when I was in San Luis Obispo, California. One time, my parents called me, and my mom said, your professor from Harvard just called us. What do we do? I'm like, you should go meet with him, or he was in Austin and he reached out to them. So I'm like, this is truly, and my friends were like, oh, what, you actually know this professor? So we stayed in touch and we would exchange ideas. And so the very fact that I came back as a doctoral student is another Chuck Willie story, because I ended up at Emory University. And the thought was, I was gonna come up here to visit because he was retiring. He retired several times. One of his retirements. And, I was on AirTran, I could jump up to Boston, and, pretty cheaply. And one of my future classmates said to stay in a place, and I meet with him. So I went up there and we had a chance to see him, and my wife Sherry and I were meeting in the office. And he's like, you were a case study for my class that was just excellent. You should have published. And I just thought he was being nice. Like he's just being nice. He's like, no. In fact, I want to work on that book, and the person I was working with is no longer here. I would love for you to work with that book with me. What do you say? I'm like, that sounds great. How did I do it from Atlanta? And kind of Sherry said, elbowing me such. I think he wants you to apply to the doctoral program. You can do it that way. Well, we just moved to Atlanta. How can we do this? And so I figured I would apply and see what would happen. Thinking I wouldn't work out the first year. It was very last minute when I did everything, but it did work out. And so we started working on the New Look at Black Families 5th edition when I got here. And that was kind of like, I came to grad school, write a book, and people were like, you're writing a book already? And just the experience and the way Chuck used to work, we'd work on the 4th floor of Gutman. We wouldn't go to his house in Concord, who worked there, kind of in the middle of everything. And people walk by and he's like, hey, Jim Honan, meet Rich Reddick, he's a smart guy, you know. And I meet all these people, I didn't know who they were. And I remember one time, he introduced me to this guy who had an English accent, and he was talking to him, and he was like, oh, Rich is such a smart guy, I've learned things from him. And a few months later, I met this guy, John, who at the time was the acting dean. And, it was kind of good to have the acting dean think that you were doing good work. And John is very dear to me. He said something to me. He's like, you're working with Chuck. So that tells me something that you're doing some of the right things. So when Chuck passed, I wrote an op-ed for the Dallas Morning News because I wanted people to understand that a son of Dallas had done all this amazing transformational work across the country, but he's an Oak Cliff guy, and he touched me in such amazing ways. And I think John read it, and I think he reached out and said, if you and Chuck are connected, then we're brothers, because he explained how he was mentored and taken care of by Chuck, and that's how I met you, because we worked on this book together. And Chuck brought us all together and told us the stories about you going to the HGSEs in the South and having to defend yourselves from being Harvard-affiliated people, because it was not an overwhelmingly positive thing, because there had been a pretty bombastic piece written by 2 Harvard professors about HBCUs. And so Jim and Chuck were legendary for going to these spaces and repairing that damage from the relationships. So that kind of mentorship is the kind of mentorship you cannot bargain for. I mean, people had wonderful experiences, but I mean, just as an example, when I was when I came back to the ed school to be class marshal in 2008, I graduated and got a job. I said, come back and be class marshal. We actually stayed at Dr. Willie's house with Mary Sue's wife with a 8-month-old toddler. Who, as Julie remember, has no problem putting his hands in people's mouths. I have a picture of him putting his hand in your mouth. I'm like, this kid. And apparently had a miserable night, but they were just like, you're part of our family, and it was fine. And so, having been part of the Willie family for all this time, I just feel the debt that I have to Chuck is paid forward to myself. So, whenever I think about interacting with him, in fact, today I had a thought. I came here for one of the early AOCCs when I was on the faculty at UT Austin, brought a group of students with me. And I said, we're gonna meet Dr. Willie. You've heard Dr. Willie's story all your lives. So you're gonna hear this story, you're gonna meet him, it's gonna be great. So we had this meeting with him on the 4th floor of Gutman, and he gets up and he said, let's go to the faculty club. And my grad students are like, we're going to the Harvard faculty club? And he took us to the faculty club. And my students, including Danielle Alessandro, who's my deputy director in my college, who's running the shop when I'm not here, still talks about that. Like, how amazing it is that your professor took us to lunch. So I try to do those kinds of things in my own mentoring journey. I'm still far, far from where he was, but he's a great milestone on that.
Let me build on that. You talk in the chapter about the challenges of taking the weight in diversity, equity, inclusion work. And certainly Dr. Willie was a good role model in that regard. But you personally, Rich, had to take the weight in an assignment you got at the University of Texas, Austin, in your role. And your president asked you to be the chair of the Eyes of Texas History Committee. So my question to you, pertinent to leading in an era of racial awakening and reckoning, and you write about this very powerful, what is it like to take the weight of responsibility of this?
Yeah, I think that chapter is a part of my therapy, just the experience, because both in IEM and really confronting racism, we're often talking to campus leaders who are engaged in critical moments. And in particular, people who work in the DEIB space are often the ones who are in the front line of those issues that are particularly thorny for institutions. So most institutions pride themselves on their longevity, on their historical record, which means you probably did some things that are not too great. And at some point, people have brought it to the attention of the institutional leaders. And then what? And so something I had realized is that virtually every time we had a chief diversity officer or something of that ilk, they would tell us about a situation like that. So whether it's at Amherst, whether it's at UT Austin or Ole Miss, something related to our history of racial equity, our history and discrimination towards LGBTQIA folks, women, immigrants, you name it, there's something in there that's problematic. So taking on the work of doing the Eyes of Texas, is just to give a quick summary. The school alma mater, Eyes of Texas, it sounds like the railroad song. You've heard it before if you see Texas play anything. And it turns out the song was crafted in 1903 and performed in a minstrel show, its first performance. So these were things that were incredibly problematic, and people wanted to sort of figure out what's going on with this. So President Hartzell did two things I'm thankful for. The first thing is he made a decision to either retain or get rid of the song. He decided to keep the song, and I'm glad he did, because having the responsibility of being the ones who either would reanimate or kill the song, didn't want that smoke. And in fact, every single person who I asked to be on the committee, because the president and I sat down and kind of figured out who should represent the university, the alumni, the band, the students, who should do this. We said, everybody asked me the question, are we deciding if it stays or not? Because I don't want to do that. Like, I either hate it or I love it or I'm indifferent, but I'm not going to be involved with that decision. So it was already done. But instead we were asked to do the research to find out what was the story behind the history, how it came to be, what was the intent, all those different things came up. And so I worked with 25 of my colleagues, and they're dear friends because I talked to any number of them pretty much on a regular basis about all kinds of things. And I found that we all had different perspectives. Some of us had strong feelings with the song. We liked it. It was part of our identity as Longhorns. Some of us had huge problems with the origin story. Some of us were like, I don't know, I just need to find out more about it. And we did that. So what was interesting about that is that I wasn't quite prepared for how it would impact me personally. I'm a scholar in the space. I do this research. I research students. I do all this stuff. So it's my day job, more or less. But when you are seen as being the representative, and so I didn't have my bingo card, you know, fielding calls from the Associated Press or New York Times or ESPN. Yes, I've been at ESPN, not for things I wanted to be on ESPN for. And of course, the other thing, of course, is it's just my identity. So I have to say, like, because I study higher education, it's a history of higher education course. I used to teach with Julie. I do all these things that makes this a good fit for me. I'm also a Black man. I'm also dealing with an issue that is particularly charged and animated, and in some sectors and some circles, assumed to be the opinion that's contrary to a lot of African American people in our community. So that was the positioning. And some cynical people would say things like, oh, they chose him because he gives the university cover if they make a decision to keep the song. Or they chose him because they already made a decision they want to have a, you know, all those things come up. And you have to kind of keep your soul intact, right? Because you're like, wait, am I actually, you know, abetting or aiding something I don't want to be part of? And I think I was able to do that pretty well because I had really good advisors and mentors and friends who I could call and say, help me through this. And I actually credit some of my colleagues who were also African-American leaders at the university who just got on the phone and said, we just need to make sure we got your back and we need to be able to be here for you if you have anything you want to talk about. And then also just the fact that it takes time, like time and headspace, right? So when I wasn't working on this on a weekend, I was thinking about it. When I was watching a TV show and there was something about a controversy, like Eyes of Texas, same thing. When the Longhorns go on a bit of a losing streak, and there's a situation where one of our football players is seen in the picture singing the song by himself, and immediately after the coach says, "Oh, you know, Rich Reddick's working on the report; he'll fix it for us." I'm like, so it was a lot, but again, the committee was wonderful. And then once we had the report finished, I thought the work was done. I thought, great, it's out in the world, it will live. But then all these other things happened. People wanted to sort of, you know, debate the findings in the report. People claimed the report had a certain skewness. And I was like, I was done with it. And so one of my very strong mentors, he takes no shorts, I think you would say that. he said to me, he's like, you're done, you finished it. So the work is done, it is there. And just letting that go is hard. But over time, I would say, I need that space away from it. But the rewarding thing I would say is that when I talk to people about this, and it's easier to talk about it in 2024 than it was in 2020, people almost always say they appreciated the work we did. That the report that we put together, they appreciated it. And then secondly, they usually say, I learned some things I did not know. And that was the intent. It wasn't to persuade people to like the song, but it's like the song. It's like, did you know these things about the song? Did you know something about the history? And some of the history is laudatory. Some of the history is problematic, right? It is the history of the state that I'm from. So I'm from Texas, so you figure that, you know what that is, right? And there's some things in there you're like, man, that's awesome. Something I wish I had not happened, right? So it is sort of a moment of, I think for the rest of my life, I will always reflect on this in some way, because for a lot of people, I will see people at a football game or whatever, and they're like, hey, you're the guy who did that Texas stuff. And usually it's positive, but it's just like people know me from that experience. And I often tell people, I hope that you have the experience of being close to something like this, because it's a very human process, right? We talk about, you know, all of the things about rigor and scholarly engagement, but it's still a very personal thing. And these decisions and these choices are made by people. And I think there were times where I felt that somebody forgot there was a person behind, right? And also, you know, getting a thicker skin is part of it, I guess, but, you know, I'm very sensitive. I don't know. It's just something that that's who I am. I don't apologize for that, but it does mean something to me when people either think like, oh, you're doing something because you have an ulterior motive. I mean, somebody told me like, this is part of your plan to become a university administrator. I'm like, there are easier ways than this. You know, so anyway, but of course, I ended up being a university administrator, so go figure. But it was truly something that I think anybody who's carried the weight of that kind of a responsibility can appreciate and understand. I wanted to write about the personal aspects of it, because the report is available online. You could look at it and see what we did. It's not really about that. It's about what is it like to be in space. And also, when you put the phone down on Friday, you think it's over, and it pops up again on Saturday morning. So anyway, but it was actually a part of, I think, of a catharsis for me to write about, because I thought nobody else understands except for people who've done the same kinds of things. And most of us have probably done something like that. I wish that you got to do it in front of ESPN and New York Times, but nevertheless, it was good to write.
Final question, we'll open for colleagues' questions as well. And so you ended in a very poignant way. You tell a story about teaching your daughter, Catherine, how to roller skate. And not surprisingly, in the early dawn, she falls, and you, Rich Reddick, father, say, falling is part of skating. And then you also admonish her, you must keep skating. So that's my final question to you, Rich Reddick. I have had the great good fortune of knowing you for about a quarter of a century. By my count, leading in higher education and teaching is your life's work.
Yeah.
And so my question to you is, what keeps you skating?
Yeah, that was a funny metaphor, because I'm a terrible skater, but confident skater. But you know, when your child keeps falling and you're like, and then you realize they're doing things to not fall, then you're not able to really engage in this. You have to be willing to fall. So let's learn how to fall safely, because fall's going to happen. And I thought about this a lot because, as I told you from the previous example, there's a lot of missteps we will take in this space. It's radical work to engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it's taboo, it's politically dangerous. And so the potential of making a misstep or doing something that maybe you wish you'd done differently, that's always there, right? So I think what makes me hopeful is the fact that the community, the folks that you all came here today, the folks who are online, the folks we work with in BCR and IEM, the fact that people find each other doing this work. And so one of the things about doing both of our programs in the professional education space is that we talk to people nationally and internationally who are engaged in these issues. And a lot of times they are one of two, or one of one doing the work on their individual campuses. And then they find there's somebody 3 states over, 3 counties over, across the ocean doing the same kind of work. And that is the encouraging part. And I'm reminded of the summer. We're very fortunate to have, and I'll make this point, 2 Texas giants. Actually, we have 3 Texas giants, Dina Lawson, Julia Garcia, and Ruth Simmons.
We have 4.
Well, you're very kind, aspiring to be a giant. But 3 women of color leaders from my home state who have led institutions during very challenging times. And right after the Supreme Court decision, we had Ruth Simmons, and this is a great, because Julia Garcia is incredible, right? She's the first Mexican-American woman to lead a higher education institution in the United States. She led UT Brownsville. She just an amazing leader, right? And we had her give an inspirational talk, and people were in tears. And we mentioned to her, tomorrow Ruth Simmons is going to be on Zoom. And Julia says, "Can I be there too?" And I'm like, "Yeah." So you're in. So we asked her, we asked Ruth Simmons, tell us about how we should approach things now the Supreme Court makes a decision. And, I'll tell you, Ruth didn't miss a beat. She was like, we keep doing the work. She didn't, it's going to be we keep doing the work. And I realized, as the first Black woman to lead an Ivy League institution, Ruth has seen some stuff. And she was unfazed. She's like, we just keep doing the work. And also reminded of the fact, like literally a few days after the decision came down, one of our precursors, Colonel Leon Holland, one of the first African Americans to attend the University of Texas at Austin, graduated in 1960, started in 1956. He asked me, "Rich, when are we going on the road? When are we going to go on the road and do some recruiting?" He's like, "When do we go back to work?" That's what we want to know. Like, we have work to do. So I think the urgency of those folks who have gone before us to remind us that the work is continual. We were never guaranteed to have smooth sailing throughout. We got to keep doing the work. The other thing is something that Ruth Simmons said to me, which I thought was powerful, is that optimism matters, right? Times are challenging, things are hard. But if young people do not see optimism, you don't see the people who are leading as optimists, it's disheartening. And that's how moments fall apart when people feel there's no hope. Now, it may be incremental, it may be gradual, it may be granular, but work is being done. And I always remind people that when I talk to a family, when I talk to a student, that is the work. When you show up on campus, that is the work. And let's do a little bit more than that, but let's also acknowledge the fact that is in fact the work. It's not always the grandiose, we got this massive policy change, we got this big metric to talk about. Sometimes it's just like, I was there when somebody needed me there. And I think the first gen, the low-income kids, the queer kids, the kids of color, kids with disabilities, the undocumented kids, all those people who feel that they're somehow a little bit further away from what is a sense of connection to the institution. And a lot of times it's just simply like, I saw you today, or I recognized you. So I have this tendency, many of you know me to do this. I'll wear a Wayabera or I'll wear a dashiki, which I think is kind of unusual for a dean to do that. I do it anyway. And a lot of times the student will say to me, "Look, I saw you, I saw you wearing a dashiki, saw you wearing Wayabera." And that's telling them like something about the presence you have is helping me through this in some way. And I'm like, it's just what I'm wearing. It's very little, but I'm remembering how important it is to have that sense of optimism and not to be ridiculous about it. I mean, I go home sometimes I'm frustrated, I'm angry, I'm not always smiling, but I think for the most part, I feel when I engage with my colleagues doing the same kind of work, when I meet young people who have dreams that are like mine or beyond mine, and I'm like, yeah, you could do that. And I'm lucky enough to be at a point where I get to see that happen. So I get to see some of my students, one of my students, Ryan Miller. Dr. Ryan Miller was at UT Austin giving a talk. And he had a slide, he had a picture of me and him at graduation. He's a big shot professor. I'm like, yeah, look at that guy. Chris Burnett, I know I just saw him text me, he's on Zoom watching, and he's doing great things in Colorado. So I mean, I just have so many people who are now doing great things, which keeps me motivated. So it's really about that. It's about the continuation of people invested in doing this work. And each of those people are doing things on their campuses, in their communities to advance equity and inclusion. So that makes me hopeful.
Please join me in thanking our friend Rich Reddick. Anything on Zoom, you'll let me know. Just raise your hand if you use your cable mic. That would be awesome. So if you have any questions for our dear friend Rich, all you.
I have one online. Hi, Rich. I loved your book and I'm so happy to see you here. I wonder if you can speak about the relationship between allyship and leadership. How are they similar and how are they different?
Oh, it's a great question. So yeah, I think about, and I use a metaphor of allyship that actually comes from queer and trans communities about how they think about allyship, right? So one of the things is there are ways to come to the aid and support the community, right? And one way is to stand alongside members of the community, right? I'm here with you. Sometimes you stand behind them, right? Because you want them to lead, you want them to take direction you want to follow. And sometimes you stand in front of them to protect, right? So I think all those kinds of ways of allyship are important. And I think even challenge the term allyship, right? Because Ernest Gibbons, I thought this in the book, sort of challenged people after, Charleston. But I think this happened to me too. I might have talked about this in the book. I think I did. But I was asked to speak at an event at the vigil, and I'm just broken. I don't have anything to say. I don't have any good words. I'm not a minister. I'm just kind of raw. And I'm like, I said to people, I said, those of you who are here, the work just got a lot harder, right? Appreciate the signs, appreciate the shirts. The work is harder because you see what we're up against, right? So it's not enough to say, I don't support these behaviors. You have to actively be the sand in the gears, to sort of phrase that in more 60s rhetoric. But this idea of being a co-conspirator kind of came to life, right? Like co-conspirators were actually working forcefully against oppression, right? Not just sort of like, hey, oppression sucks, but I'm actually going to do things that interrupt and disrupt oppression. And there's different ways of doing it, right? So I think sometimes people think, well, there's one way of doing that, and it's throwing your body literally in front of things. That's one way, but there are multiple ways of doing that. So I think one thing about holding allyship is thinking constantly to yourself, can I do more? And can I be in the co-conspirator space, moving past allyship in some regards? And also, am I taking the lead from the communities that need support? And not letting, well, you know what, I'm going to stand beside you. Maybe I don't need to sit. Maybe I need to sit behind me, or I need you in front of me, right? So I think that's how I would respond.
Thank you. Please go ahead. Be right over.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm interested in, can you please share any of the experiences or particular time I felt really hard personally, and you felt like, okay, why am I doing this or this, and should I keep doing what I'm doing? Like having those self-reflective questions, questioning yourself, and how have you come out of that? How have you negotiated with yourself? Like, okay, I am doing that. What?
That's a really good question. I would say there's a lot of imposter syndrome that comes, I think, in these roles sometimes. And so what you have to do is sort of have a sense of who you are, right? And then also acknowledge the fact that you're insecure for a reason, right? I don't have everything figured out. I'm okay with that. I think there was something that was positive to this one point in time, that people who lead are people who have it all figured out and they got all the answers. When you talk to leaders, they'll tell you like, no, I don't, but I do have a sense of who I am. I do have a sense that what matters matters. And I will say those moments of feeling secure are pretty constant, because you're always thinking like, sure they could have possibly done this job with me. Or you do things that, in reflection, you wish you had done differently. Or you hear that from your people, like, yeah, could have done that better. But for the most part, I've been lucky to have people who I've worked, supervisors who were developmental. They're like, I want to help you get better. And this is an opportunity for us to figure out what we can do better. One of the things I talk about in mentoring work is that a mentor who's really invested in you will champion your successes, right? But they will also cover your failures in a certain degree. They might tell you personally, like, hey, you messed that up, but they won't do it publicly. They'll always make sure that at least the best parts of what come forward. And also, what can we take from that and learn from it? And I think, you know, I'm often in a space where I have to remind my students that, no, you're not a mistake. No, we didn't make a mistake in the mission. You actually belong here. And I say to myself, well, maybe you made a mistake hiring me, right? You know, especially when the days are hard. But I also will tell you something. One of the greatest gifts I had is, well, you'll understand soon enough. I have a 13-year-old and 16. And when I go home, it's like your dad and you get your dad things. And they like certain things. They think it's kind of cool I do certain things. They don't really understand the budgetary and the, you know, decision-making stuff so much. And that's actually been a blessing, because then I realized I also have to make sure that I at least exude a sense of confidence, because they need to see that too. And I also realized sometimes I said to myself, well, maybe I was not the best person to do this job, but I'm doing it. They got me, so what will we do? And I actually had a conversation with a colleague of mine. I'm like, what if we were the second choice? You're here. Do something with this, right? And I think having those kinds of talks with my leader mentors has been helpful, because the self-doubt is something we all do. Some people are better at camouflaging than others. Some people would argue you should camouflage it. I don't think it's great to have a plenary speech and say, I'm scared, but sometimes you confide in people like, yeah, I don't know where we're going, or I think where we're going may be this direction, but it might change. And having the ability to talk to my close colleague about that is really helpful. But also acknowledging to people that we don't always have everything mapped out perfectly, and we do make mistakes.
Take our final question, then we'll close.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being here. And thank you for lifting up the extraordinary women of color and Black women who have led these major institutions. And thank you to Dr. Honan for acknowledging your leadership as well. I am curious, particularly in the context of the most recent events here at Harvard, I wonder what advice, wisdom, and guidance you have, and maybe you think those women you referenced would offer, especially to students of color, women of color, and Black women, as we think about how to navigate these cultural wars. What has history taught us? And how do we make sure we continue to do the work and protect our psychological well-being so that we're not internalizing the impact of these cultural wars on our well-being?
That is an amazing question. And it's powerful because, you know, it's been painful for me afar as a person who cares about this place to see what's happened at this institution in particular to leaders of color, women of color in particular, Black women more specifically. And the thing I think about is the importance of grace, right? So one of my former students, Mariama, who's a postdoc at USC, Mariama talks a lot about, when I learned from her, I learned about grace, like to grant grace, to give grace, and to expect grace, right? And we're in a time where I think that's in short supply. And we're also in a time where I think the vitriol and the vindictiveness, and I'll just call it evil, is at a peak. And I think it's incumbent upon us who know and are around these phenomenal people to support them and to also embrace their humanity, because, you know, one of the worst things is this sort of perfection syndrome where, oh, this person made a mistake, therefore their entire career is invalid. No, I mean, again, I'm reminded of the mediocrity of the people accusing people of shortcomings versus these people who actually have put in the work and done the work. I honestly think it's a time for reflection. I honestly think it's a time to not forget that these leaders are leading in tumultuous times where there aren't good answers. And history is illustrative. And I actually think one of the challenges is to almost the need to frame these in terms that we've seen these things before. We know how this thing goes on. I was reminded when I saw recently somebody in the political sphere burning a book. And I was like, book burning never ends well, right? When has a good person ever burned the book? Like, when has that ever been a thing, right? So I'm like, we should sort of call out these kinds of things. But it also speaks to the importance, I think, of us as a higher education as an entity being much more engaged with our communities. Because I think this is a moment where higher education is kind of standing alone. And there are a lot of reasons why that's happening. But one of the reasons I think it's important to think about is like, so people who are working in nonprofit spaces, in corporate spaces and so forth, need to understand the work that's happening here is truly resistance work, because a lot of times we're doing things or taking on issues that have not been taken on in other spaces. We are the test bed. And therefore, we need the grace to have the space to try things that may not be successful because it hasn't worked anywhere else. Because if it had, we would do that. And I think it's the thing that I am most pained by is that if we haven't achieved perfection, the solution is not to go scorched earth and just reject everybody who's in the space. The solution is to say, how can we give more grace, understanding, patience to see how these institutions can respond effectively? And then how can we be engaged to help? I don't know if that's a great answer, but the sentiment of your question matters, right? And I think it's an important question for us to walk away with is how do we invest and support the most vulnerable? Because even leading is a vulnerable spot, right? As we know. So I want to hold that question in my mind and think about it for a while. So I don't know if I came close to answering it, but
Thank you.
I am thinking about that question. I will be thinking about that for some time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Rich Reddick, honor and privilege to be in this conversation with you. Please join me in thanking our colleague, Rich Reddick.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, friends.